Gasps filled the air, but the daughter barely heard them. Her mind spun, trying to grasp what this meant. Her whole life, she had believed she was an only child, that her father had been honest, that their family was whole. The widow clutched her chest, her face pale. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He would have told me." But deep down, something inside her wavered. Had there been signs? Things she had ignored? The young man swallowed hard. "I never met him," he admitted. "He left before I was born. My mother never spoke of him much. I only knew he existed." His eyes flickered to the casket. "And now I'll never get the chance." The weight of his words sank into the room. The truth had come too late. The man they had all gathered to mourn was not who they thought he was. He had built a life on secrets, secrets that were now unraveling in front of everyone. Then, just as the room sat in stunned silence, the elderly woman spoke one last time. "He may be gone," she said, her voice heavy with meaning, "but the truth isn't buried with him." The widow turned away, tears slipping down her face. The daughter looked at the young man, emotions clashing in her eyes. The guests stood in quiet shock, knowing they would never see the man in that casket the same way again. The silence stretched on, heavy with emotions no one knew how to process. The daughter looked at the young man, her half-brother, unsure of what to say. He looked just as lost, standing there with a past he never got to understand and a family he had never met. The widow wiped her tears and turned to the elderly woman. "Did he ever say anything about us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The elderly woman gave her a long, thoughtful look. "He never stopped looking back," she admitted. But he was too afraid to face what he left behind. A deep sigh passed through the room, a mixture of sadness, anger, and understanding. The guests slowly began to leave, murmuring amongst themselves, forever changed by what they had learned. The daughter took a shaky step toward her half-brother. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted. He gave her a small, hesitant nod. "Neither do I," he said. But as they stood there, two lives once separated now brought together by truth. One thing was certain. The past had finally been uncovered, and the future was theirs to decide. Her heart ached as she faced a reality that grew harder to ignore. The courtroom was no longer enough. She couldn't simply rule on his case as she would any other. Elijah had already captured a piece of her heart, and there was no going back now. But what would happen when the system, the law, and her own sense of duty collided with her growing desire to give him what he needed most? The clock was ticking, and the tension had reached a boiling point. Just when Judge Williams thought she was coming to terms with her emotions, another unexpected twist sent everything spiraling. A call came early one morning from the foster care agency. Elijah's case had been reassigned to another judge. The news hit her like a punch to the gut. They were transferring him to a different courtroom, and she wouldn't have the chance to continue overseeing his future. The reason? Allegations of partiality. Her connection to Elijah had raised questions about her ability to remain impartial. Suddenly, everything she had hoped for seemed even more out of reach. The very thing that had made her fight for Elijah's future, the bond they shared, was now the barrier keeping her from being the one to make a difference in his life. As the legal system began to move forward, Elijah was once again facing an uncertain future. The new judge, a strict and detached figure, didn't seem to understand the depth of what had transpired between Elijah and Judge Williams. Their connection was dismissed as sentimental. And the worst part, Elijah's case was being fast-tracked for adoption by a family that wasn't ready to love him the way he deserved. The thought of Elijah being placed in yet another home with strangers who might never understand him tormented Judge Williams. What was worse, following the law and letting him go, or defying the very system that had been her career for years. Each option felt like a betrayal, but she knew there was no going back now. She had already crossed a line, and the stakes had never been higher. Would she be willing to risk everything to fight for a child who was already slipping away? The tension was suffocating, and the decision loomed over her with unbearable weight. The day of Elijah's final hearing arrived, and the weight on Judge Williams' shoulders was unbearable. As she walked into the courtroom, she saw him sitting there, looking smaller than ever, his eyes filled with uncertainty. The adoption papers were in front of her, ready for a signature that would forever change his life. Everything in her mind screamed to step back, to follow the rules, to let him go. But her heart had already made its choice. With trembling hands, she began to speak. "I cannot, in good conscience, approve this adoption." The words were out before she could second-guess them. The room fell silent, everyone looking at her as though she had justified the very fabric of the system. She knew this would cost her. She knew the consequences of her actions could be severe, but in that moment, none of that mattered. "I believe this child deserves more than just a foster home or a temporary placement. He deserves a chance to belong, to know what it means to be loved unconditionally." She paused, her voice breaking. "And I want to give him that." The room erupted into murmurs, and for a long moment, no one knew what would happen next. The other judge, the social workers, the legal team, all were stunned by the decision. But it was Elijah who broke the silence. He looked up at Judge Williams, his eyes wide, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. Not just any smile, but one that radiated pure hope. Then, as if fate had decided it wasn't done testing them yet, a lawyer from the adoption agency stood up, holding a thick envelope. He'd been quiet throughout the hearing, but now his voice was sharp, serious. "Your Honor, there's something you need to know. We've just received new information. The adoption paperwork you've been presented with has an error. It's not for Elijah. It was meant for another child." The church was packed. Friends, family, and distant acquaintances had all gathered to pay their final respects. But in the sea of grieving faces, one person stood out, a quiet elderly Black woman sitting alone in the back row. No one spoke to her. No one acknowledged her presence. It was as if she didn't belong. As the service went on, whispers filled the room. Who was she? Why was she here? The guests exchanged curious glances, but no one dared to ask. It wasn't until the reception that she finally stepped forward. With a steady voice and eyes filled with unspoken pain, she revealed a truth that sent shockwaves through the entire crowd. Guests echoed across the room. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others lowered their gaze in shame. But one thing was certain, no one would ever forget what she had just said. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes was now fixed on the elderly woman, their curiosity turning into unease. She took a slow breath, steadying herself before she spoke again. "You all think you knew him," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But there's something you never saw, something he kept hidden." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some exchanged nervous glances, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The deceased had been well-respected, kind, generous, admired by many. What could she possibly mean? A man near the front cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but who are you?" His voice carried a mix of skepticism and impatience. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I was someone he hoped you'd never find out about," she answered. A sharp tension filled the air. No one knew what she would say next, but they couldn't look away. A heavy silence settled over the room. Some guests leaned in, desperate to hear more, while others stiffened, unsure if they even wanted to know. The elderly woman took a step forward, her frail hands trembling slightly, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. "I knew him long before most of you did," she continued, her voice steady. "Before the suits, before the speeches, before he became the man you all admired." She let her words linger, watching their reactions. Some shook their heads, unwilling to accept that their beloved friend, father, or mentor had any secrets. A woman in the front row, the deceased daughter, spoke up. "That's impossible. My father